Hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for our Race and Photography panel with Refract Journal. The moderators of this panel are myself, Kelsey McFall, and Madison Treese. We are both PhD students at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and we're excited to be here with you today as part of Refract Journal's first online symposium and third published volume entitled Hauntings and Traces, which we see as an invitation to reflect, explore, engage, and provoke theories, scholarship, art, and case studies in as different ways of engaging with this theme. Each of our panelists today contributed original work and research to the volume that offers interventions into issues of, among others, memory, archives, and erasure. We have a few questions for each of you. But before jumping in, we'd like to ask you to introduce yourselves with your institutional affiliations, as well as give us a few words about your research and/or artistic practice, and a brief synopsis of your contributions to the journal. Axelle, would you like to begin?
Sure. So my name is Axelle Toussaint. I am a PhD candidate in visual studies at UC Santa Cruz. I have been researching colonial and post-colonial experiences of trauma and fragmentation in the islands of the Western Indian Ocean, and I've been focusing in particular on performance, and I have actually started developing my own performance practice, which I talk about in the article that I published in Refract.
Wonderful, thank you. JB?
Yeah, my name is JB Brager. I received my PhD in Women's and Gender Studies from Rutgers University, New Brunswick in 2018. And I am currently adjunct faculty at Rutgers in history as well as gender studies. The piece that I have in Refract Journal is called The Trophy and the Appeal, and it's about German colonial photography, and particularly the practice of looking at images that don't appear directly to depict violence that we can understand through the rubric of colonial violence. And so that's part of my larger work on memory studies, particularly in a colonial context, German and US colonization. And I am currently working on actually a graphic novel project that is looking at intimate memory, working with visual archives from my own family, which is a German Jewish family that came to the United States as refugees from Nazi Germany.
That sounds super interesting. So first, I just want to say I loved both of your pieces. Your contributions to this volume of Refract, I thought were really sort of like beautifully laid out. And you asked so many interesting questions, and I'm so excited for this panel because I think they really have a great conversation. So hopefully whoever is watching this has read both the pieces and is feeling the same way I do, that they kind of like work together really well. So the first question we have for you is, both of your projects seem initiated by a personal experience in the archives. Could you tell us about that encounter in the archive, as well as the way your relationship to the archive and/or the specific set of images you work with in each of your essays has developed over time? So building off of that, what is gained or enriched in your work by including the autobiographical angle of your own experience? JB, do you want to go first?
Sure. It's so hard to know on Zoom. Yeah, so the photographs that I'm writing about in this piece, I found in primarily in the Prussian Secret State Archives. They're not secret, in Berlin in 2015. And, you know, this was my only chance to do archival research during my my PhD work. Like most grad students, I felt really constrained by the funding structure of the university. You know, doing archival research, I think, is like particularly difficult. And so I think like when I was entering the archive, the main thing that I felt was like pressure to perform, that I like needed to find something that I could use for my research in this archive, or else I had nothing, right? Like I wouldn't get another trip. I was like running out of days. And I think that really like shaped the experience initially of looking at these images where I was like trying to find something that I could use, right? And so, as I was looking at the images, I was like, why am I trying to use this? Like, these are images of human beings who experience really terrible things, or they're images of people who perpetrated really terrible things, and also people who had full lives in both instances, right? And so I kind of slipped into this different experience of just like trying to be there with the subjects, which also like didn't end up working. And I left the archive just like really confused with a bunch of like bad stolen cell phone shots of the archive. And I was like, archival research is terrible. I'm bad at it. This is monstrous. And then, you know, I didn't return to it for a while. And it was kind of like through the practice of like, I'm trying to think through like, you know, I think Axelle's work is actually helpful in like cohering for me this like long sitting with images where like, you know, over time I like tried cutting them up, I tried cropping them, I tried you know, like writing narratives from the viewpoint of the people in the images. I tried not looking at them, and you know, the conclusion that I sort of came to is like an impasse. And I think that actually what I have decided to do is just to like sit in the impasse. So yeah, that's where I'm kind of at.
Axelle, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yeah. So yeah, for me it was actually really interesting, my encounters in the archive. I think there's several stages of the encounter, or maybe several successive encounters in the archive, and sometimes those encounters actually took place outside of the physical archive, but I still consider that they are archival encounters. I came across this set of photographs that's entitled Types Comoriens, Comorian Types, which depict those indigenous Comorian women, which was accompanied by very little information, no specific date. I found them in the Archive of the Colonies, which is located in the south of France, in Aix-en-Provence. At the time, my initial reaction was pretty mild. I didn't really consider that those were images of violence, and this is something I explained in the article. I think this has to do with also the placement of the images. There were in this album with images of the local flora of the Comoros, and I think that kind of like oriented my initial reading. They were also not placed next to each other in the album, so it took me some time to sort of understand that this was actually a series, so part of one and the same photo shoot. I think it also might explain my difficulty perceiving the violation that was produced and perpetrated by the images. So this was kind of my first encounter in the archive. I didn't really make sense of it. And as I explained in the article, I think the images kept coming back to me. I kept sort of haunting me. So I presented the paper on the images, and I felt really terrible about my work, presenting those images and showing them to the audience. So I had a second and eventually subsequent encounters. And the last encounter is actually taking place in the streets in the city where I live. And I consider it to be an archival encounter because I actually see those archival images as a space of encounter following Ariel Azoulay. So yeah, I'm happy to go into details about these different encounters if you want to.
Yeah, I guess I want to circle back to the second part of the question. And I think JB, you framed it really interesting about this kind of impasse and sort of sitting in the impasse. And I wonder if including your experience, and this is for Axelle as well, sort of relaying your personal narrative as you move through the archive, do you think this is a way of forcing the reader to sort of sit with you in that impasse or to feel your discomfort that they might not have acknowledged earlier? And I'm still really curious about this kind of autobiographical component.
Yeah, I think like methodologically, the placement of the self in the archive like definitely comes out of a demand like within gender studies to always like think about the self as a political actor and like that I am not separate from the research that I'm doing. But it also becomes a key part of the argument that I'm making because and so in that sense, like the autobiographical angle becomes a kind of modeling because a huge part of the argument that I'm making, which, you know, it seems like a very simplistic claim and in a way it is, it's just that like when we look at things, we are different people who are looking, right? And so what we see is shaped by the entirety of ourselves. And so what I see and what you see is not the same. And so if we have no guarantee that we're all seeing the same thing and we're all interpreting what we're seeing the same way, then it kind of dispels the belief that, you know, a picture is worth 1,000 words, or that we can rely upon the evidentiary value of the image as truth. And that's really important, both for thinking about like the way that site is culturally and socially constructed, right? And also that you know, something that looks like or doesn't look like violence, right, can be violent. And also that things that are very clearly images of violence can be interpreted as positive or negative violence by different viewers. And so, you know, I really wanted to think about like what shapes my eye, right? And so I asked this question in the article that's like, who am I when I look at the image, right? And I can't look away. And who am I when I can't look at the image or I refuse to look at the image? Because all of these practices are shaped by, you know, I really like, as a visual thinker, I really like think about the eye as like this site of sedimentation, like all of my knowledge and experiences and identity and all of the baggage and the weight of that is like the veil that I have to look through. And so I think that's really important, particularly and I know this is like kind of a question that you asked later, but particularly in visual studies, which is a field that I think often assumes this shared site of looking, where we give these very universal interpretations of what we're seeing as though we can rely on everyone to be seeing the same thing that we are.
Thank you.
So I would say that in my case, it really came out of this performance, this conference paper that I presented at McGill, where I showed the images again, and it just really started haunting me. So it was a really strong experience and a sort of impasse, not knowing exactly what to do with this. And this kind of eventually forced me or pushed me to cut out the images and try to reflect on this. But I think this really strong experience, this strong personal experience prompted me to like reflect back on my experience in the archive, for example, just entering the physical space of the archive and being denied access because the person at the entrance felt that my research topic wasn't legitimate enough. And I think this accessibility problem might have had something to do with the fact that I'm a Black woman. So I just started really thinking about my physical experience in the archive and the way that I am really approaching this material, which is very, as you said, JB, it's very personal, it's not universal, it's particular. And I just also started thinking about how it is biased as well, because I am myself a product of the colonial system. So I wanted to really acknowledge that I also, the way I look at the material, the way I approach it is also sort of indebted to this colonial system that produced me.
Thank you to both of you. There's such rich answers, and I feel as though you're in conversation with each other in so many ways. And as we move to the next question, I think both of you have also gestured at this. Axelle, just recently when you talked about presenting at the conference, and JB, you evoked visual studies already. And so I wonder, both of you are kind of confronting or wrestling with violence within colonial photography, including like different forms of violence, including the photographic gaze in the past, as well as the kind of violence of ethnographic descriptions of images in the present. And both of you could wrestle with this or handle it in different ways. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the ways that you perceive this tension around colonial violence in visual studies and your own particular interventions. Can you comment on what you believe your intervention, whether it's not including the images or modifying the images in some way, offers both for you personally and also to the larger field as an intervention? Axelle, maybe do you want to go first?
Yeah, I just wanted to let you know that I'm not hearing you very well. I think my Wi-Fi connection is weak. So yeah, I also think that the violence in the images that I'm talking about is not so obvious, and it took me some time to actually come to realize it. And eventually what I'm writing about is that the violence is really folded into the act of looking and in the act of describing the images of violence. But the problem is that the act of looking and describing are actually the very central exercises of art history, which is sort of my discipline. So I think that cutting out the images was in a way trying to look away, to sort of refuse to submit to the disciplinary method of the field. And I think that because I'm actually in the visual studies program, I think that I have been engaged to think differently about looking. I think that visual studies is actually an extensive, very capacious field that offers the potentiality of a different approach, of a sort of untraining of the eye. So I'm still unsure whether my intervention could constitute a method. And I'm also unsure that coming up with a new method was really my goal, writing this article and thinking about these images. I think, if anything, I would say that this piece was more of an injunction to myself and potentially to others to be really consciously wary, consciously suspicious of any type of protocol approaching material like this, such ambivalent and also violent material. I think it was also about engaging or sort of questioning the bias that is really inherent in the expertise that we're supposed to gain through a PhD program, for example. The objective knowledge that we're supposed to acquire. I think I was trying to really propose a subjective partial knowledge that is coming from a very situated body, which is my own. And I would say that it was also important for me to actually start valuing my own experience as a Black colonized subject. I think that's an experience that has been often devalued or ignored. So there was also an effort on my end to start thinking from this particular experience.
I think that when I came to this project, I was sort of working backwards from doing research, particularly on Holocaust photography and history. And so the earlier images that I was looking at, because I came to them through this sort of backwards gaze through German history, were situated for me within the presumption of violence, because I like already had the text, right? Like I had the timeline, I had the like statistics, and I was thinking about the idea of the prehistory of violence and the way that we think about historical time, right? So, for example, maybe the comparable images to ones that Axelle is looking at in German Southwest Africa, the sort of anthropological images that turn Black people into flesh, right, from Hortense Fillers into these specimens, were taken by Eugen Fischer, who was ultimately a core ideologue of Nazi racial policies, and who was responsible for the program of one of those responsible for the program of sterilizing Black Germans under Nazi Germany, right? So I was working from this like history in the 1930s and 40s into this history from the earlier regime, and so I kind of had these assumptions where I was trying to think about the relationship between photos that didn't look like they were particularly violent and photos that showed extraordinary violence, right? So for example, in this article, I write about an image of a lynching that is in an album with like literally photos of like German soldiers skinny dipping, and photos of hunting trophies, like all different kinds of things. I also write in a larger version of the project about these images that are extreme close-ups of the like horribly mutilated bodies of murdered African women. And in the original project, which was my dissertation, I included those images. And I felt at the time like we needed to be forced to look at them. That following, and Axelle also talks about her work, but following Ariel Azoulay, that the photograph is an injunction, that it contains a demand, and so we have to look, and that will force us to do something, right? That it will force us to be better, and Tina Camp, who it was on my committee, it was like, why are you reproducing this violence? And I was kind of like, oh shit, I'm reproducing this violence, right? And so I mentioned previously, when I submitted the dissertation, my intervention from that question was to crop the images, right? To only show things that I thought were like very relevant to the project. And then, my intervention in this article, and I'm not talking about an intervention in a field, and it's like the intervention into my own way of thinking, right? Was to not include the images, but I'm still describing them, right? Which is still a form of reproduction. And so I don't think that there is a clear answer here. And this is, I think a tension that's in my article and also in Axelle's. And, Axelle, you talk about like the violence has been done. We can't undo it, right? And so the question becomes like, why are these photographs taken in the first place? And why do we continue to take them? Why is the question of, violence to the Black body still like a question of visual studies? And then, what can, honestly, a question that I have for myself is like, what am I doing? and why? Why is anything that I'm doing important? And so what you're seeing in this article is literally just like, here's what I'm thinking about. Here's the information that I have. Like, maybe this will be helpful for someone. And part of this might be that, I've gone through the process of like getting the PhD, being on the job market, realizing the job market is fake and awful, like being disillusioned with academia. And I'm like, this is like bad. You can crop this out if you want, but like, I don't care about visual studies. Like, I don't care about the field. I care about this conversation. Like, what the fuck do we do with these histories of violence that we have these different relationships to, and with these images that we're drawn to and like can't stop thinking about and like feel the need to write about, but are also that also risk reproducing violence, and how are we participating in violence, and like where are we complicit, and where are we identified, and where are our bodies in these rubrics, and like what do we do with all of this? So that, I don't know if that's an answer, but like that ramble is like basically what I'm trying to do.
And just to add to that, I also feel that in both pieces, we're really trying to negotiate such a complex issue that has no right solution. There is no right or wrong. We're just, I don't want to speak for you, but I just really feel like we're trying different ways, and it's difficult.
Yeah. And like other places I've written, so for example, the Dana Schutz portrait of Emmett Till, like, she writes about, Dana Schutz talks about like the reason that she made that painting is because she's like trying to work something out for herself, right? Like, she is trying to think through some sort of like identification or demand or like feeling that she has when looking at those original source materials. And so like, I don't blame her or like question the desire to like make the painting, right? But then you throw it away, right? Like, then you burn it or bury it, or like it's like, what is our like individual process? And then what about that process is helpful for the larger conversation, where we are all just trying to like figure out, again, like, I think it really comes down to like ethical practice, not as academics, but as academics who are people, right? Who are trying to not just think about photography, but think about photography as a practice that has effects, right? That has real impacts on people in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a important place of tension to just keep sort of like trying to figure it out and moving in between these two sort of positions of like show, don't show. I know that I teach a class on race, and I'm always forcing my students to have this conversation. So I'm going to be really excited to actually show them us engaging in it someday. But I do want to move on to the next question. The body as a subject and as a category for analysis maintains a strong presence and absence in both of your pieces. So I want to ask both of you what the roles of gender and the body are in your work, perhaps particularly in terms of embodied practice and performativity. Maybe we can start with Axelle. I'd be curious to know about, since we sort of ended on the role of performativity, if you have a particular thought.
Yeah, actually, thinking about this question, because actually the images that I was looking at did only depict women, and actually wouldn't want to assume that the persons, the people who are photographed are women. I actually don't know. But I think they were perceived as women by photographer, and I think that did matter. I just wanted to read this quote by Wangechi Mutu. This is something I think about often. She writes that females carry the marks, language, and nuances of their culture more than the male. Anything that is despised or desired is always placed on the female body. And in my article, I was talking about pornotroping, or the pornotropic gaze, the sort of sexualization and fetishization of the object of the gaze. And I don't think that's only applies to female bodies, but it seems that the female body has been like the preferred object of the colonial gaze. And I'm saying this, I mean, this is something that I actually saw in the archive. It's quite obvious just by the sheer number of photographs of Black or African or indigenous female bodies that I found. And I think for that reason also, because of that large number of representations of female bodies, my eye got sort of used, or I guess used to seeing these images, especially of naked Black and indigenous female bodies. And I think in some ways my eye has been trained to let the violence of these images go unnoticed. So in my piece, one of my intentions was really to operate a sort of reversal in which I'm trying to sense and feel and think with and through my own female body. So again, that's something I was saying earlier. I think I wanted to go against an idea of an objective knowledge, but instead be very consciously situated. And I think that I'm saying all this because at the end of the piece, I'm actually turning to performance. Mm-hmm. And I think that for me, performance was really a way to act and to act out rather than describe. I was trying to create more than to comment and to embody rather than analyze. So I'm not saying that this is a universal response, but I think this was my response, my solution to the problem that was posed by these images.
Do you mind elaborating a little bit about the performance itself?
Sure. So I initially, when I was confronted with the images and I showed them to the audience at this conference at McGill, and I cropped them, I left the faces on the PowerPoint, and it still didn't feel right to me. So eventually I ended up cutting out the entire figure of the subjects, and so giving those white sort of blanks, which I called white shoals, which I conceived as spaces of reflection for the gaze. And eventually I felt this was unsatisfactory as well. And I sort of staged one last encounter with these images in the street. So I printed an image, one of the photographs with the cutout, and I sat with the image for a certain period of time. And this was for me a way to really be present, to attend to the existence of these persons, and also in some ways to denounce the violence that has been done against them without reproducing the images. So I'm not saying that this is, again, a universal solution, but I think that for me, it was really important to really assert both their presence and my own.
Right, thank you. And there are pictures of this performance in the article, so people can go look at that. Great. JB, did you want to respond to this question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think in terms of gender and performance, in the history that I'm talking about and in the images that I'm talking about, there's really this question of certainly the way that that power is oriented around gender in society, and then also how death is oriented in relation to gender in society. And so the reality that is being pictured in these images is that men were targeted for death, and women were targeted for sexual violence, and children, especially young boys, are targeted. Likely for sexual violence as well, but particularly for embodying this space of the enslaved survivor, right? And so there's like these different orientations to violence, these different experiences of violence to the body. I mean, like one of the things that that really like blew me away, especially because the evidence of this is like still in museums, including here in New York. But there's this image of Herero women being forced to like clean the skulls of murdered Herero men to be sent to these different anthropological institutions, right, around the world. And I thought about like the specific gendering of that labor, the way that there's almost this like I talk about it as like a almost like maternal labor in this like pornotropic, really perverse way, right? That if violence in this mode is the destruction of like the ability to reproduce generations in life, right? It's like an ending. Then, I think that image like really perfectly represented that for me. That there's like this violence that like there's no family, there's no inheritance, there's no it's just like a total destruction, but that people lived through in a literal sense. And so I guess the performance on my part started to become one of like imagination, where I was looking really hard within the context of survivors of violence in the images for like refusal and resistance in images, which I think is a common impulse, right? And the thing that I like started to think about was the way that that survivors within these images would relate to the making of the image in the mode of refusal. And so like the image that I talk about is that in the photograph, there's two women who have just turned their backs to the camera, right? And they're just refusing to look. And I think that, that I really wanted to sort of like think through what survival and refusal look like through the lens of gender, because the violence itself was gendered. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I'm really struck by that image, the image of those two women with their backs turned, which I think you conclude the piece with. And as we've been talking, I've been thinking too about Axelle's images of herself attending to the print in the street, which are images, I believe, mostly of her back turned to the photographer and her face turned towards the cutout image. And I think, Axelle, you referenced Sadia Hartman there, where you're talking about this is a kind of embodied sitting with the dead, or kind of sitting with and attending to the impasse, but in a very embodied way. And that even the orientation of one's body as one does this thing is really significant and important. And And I'm wondering about that kind of that orientation as we move towards the last question. JB, you mentioned imagination, and I think both of your pieces really engage your imaginations as well as your readers' imaginations and desires perhaps towards decolonial or anti-colonial ends. So we imagine, or we might even see ourselves in the women with their backs turned away. And we might find ourselves wanting to kind of fill in the cutout images and put something back in them. So I'm curious for you both to talk about the role of imagination in your own work, the ways that you're playing with it for yourself and also for your readers, and particularly maybe as it relates to Black female embodiment and the kind of relationship with the imagination there. What do you think the imagination makes possible? Do you think that there's limits or pitfalls to engaging your imagination or your readers' imagination in these ways? And I don't know who wants, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, I kind of want to start because I think, you talk about like a pitfall of the imagination. And I think for me, the pitfall of the imagination is perhaps to see myself in the women with their backs turned away. Because I'm a white person, and beyond that, I'm a white person of German descent, and my, great grandfathers, both of them were in the German military at the time, that this colonization was taking place. And, I don't have any, I don't think it was a small percentage of the German population went to German Southwest Africa, and I'm pretty sure they were in Germany. But they were benefiting from the way that bourgeois German society was benefiting from becoming a colonial power. And so if I was to orient myself in this image, I'm behind the camera, right? Like I'm the perpetrator, best case scenario, right? I'm the perpetrator of violence. And so the demand of the imagination is to be like, what puts me behind the camera, and what do I do with the horror of that? And then what does that demand, right? Like what does knowing that that's my positionality demand of me? And that's the imagination that we have to engage.
No, thank you for that. I'm just struck by, I think even the way this question is framed, like we think about imagination in such like liberatory and positive ways. And it's really important in terms of a corrective to think about like, what are the difficult things that we have to imagine, particularly depending on our embodiment and our own histories and relationships to these archives and these images. So thank you for that kind of, for pushing back on it in those ways and thinking about it.
Yeah.
It's not always.
No, I mean, I think about, like Christina Sharp's work is really helpful here when she talks about wake work, and people have asked her like a number of times, like, do white people do wake work? And it's like, we're all in the wake of racial violence, but we need to figure out, like, what is the work that we have to do within that? And that work is specific and different for white people.
Axelle go ahead.
I would say that in my case, I initially had recourse to my imagination when I came across the images because there wasn't much data about them. So I kind of felt compelled to recreate a narrative or come up with a narrative. And then I had a second moment when I presented the images at the conference, and I cropped the bodies and I left the faces, and I just actually thought that the audience was recreating the body using their imagination. It was sort of recomposing the bodies according to their own potentially fantasies, and this was highly problematic for me actually. And so I would also like to push back against this question. I think really in my piece I'm being very wary about imagination, and I would rather discourage it rather than encourage it. I see imagination as a sort of remaking of the images, and I think this has a potential for fetishism. I think that imagination has pornotropic tendencies. Whether we want it or not, we are socialized in a certain way, especially in the West. So I would actually be really, really wary of this remaking of images. I think that my goal in this piece again, was to manifest presence of the subjects of my own, rather than try to like compose new images or recompose these images.
I'm struck in your answer. I think the imagination is really also a visual exercise, or the ways that we think about it is, it's like re-envisioning something or visioning something again. And both of what you were gesturing toward is this more embodied presence approach that is not just your eyes as if they've been detached from the rest of yourself in the way that self appears in the world, but that you need to be there as a wholly embodied, racialized, sexualized being, and that's the way to attend to these images and their history. And Axelle, as you mentioned just then, I think haunting or being haunted by things. And I wonder, maybe to close just briefly, if both of you could talk about the way that you see haunting and or the trace in your work. Probably this is something that we've gestured towards a lot, but I'd like you perhaps to speak just briefly about maybe what drew you to this theme and the ways that you see it working for you.
Yeah, for me, the haunting manifested itself in like the return of these images, and I tried to the literal return of the images which were on my computer, and I just couldn't look at them anymore. I just couldn't stand them anymore. And I couldn't think about them, and I couldn't visualize them in my own head. So this is why I initially cut them out. And I think that in my work, I tried to sort of convey that in the writing itself, having those different sentences that recur in the article. I think it was also manifested by this sort of like physical disgust that the images prompted, which I also tried to convey in the article. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that in this case, there's the kind of like personal haunting where like an image gets in your mind and you like can't stop thinking about it. And that wasn't the case for any of these images. And, it certainly has happened, but with the images I'm writing about here, they didn't personally haunt me. But I do think about haunting in a sociological sense, like, in an Avery Gordon sense, very deeply here, where the history of German Southwest Africa and the contributions of German Southwest Africa to the visual lexicon of anti-Blackness and of settler colonialism and indigenous African identity, like all of these ways in which this archive and history are important are an absent presence, particularly in the US and Germany, where, I think that this history is deeply understudied, and also in Holocaust memorialization, where we don't talk about it practically at all. Like it's coming back, but like very recently, and because of the very active work of Namibian activists, right? Like, and there's a deep resistance to talking about anti-Blackness and anything kind of outside of this sort of like very tight narrative of the Holocaust as an event that is perpetrated against 6 million Jews between like 1933 and 1942, and that's it, right? So, returning or sort of like making visible that which is like already present, I think is the haunting for me in this story.
Okay, so that concludes our panel. I really think we had an amazing discussion. I want to thank all of our panelists and to the audience who joins us and watches this. You can access our panelists' work and the full publication on the Refract website, as well as the other session recordings for the Haunting and Traces Digital Symposium. And in conclusion, we just want to wish everybody a healthy and safe 2021. Thank you.